the point of nuclear weapons if we never get to use them? Well, okay, we did. Once in 1945, we killed tens of thousands of people in Japan with 2 atomic bombs. But that was a one-off, right? An extreme situation. No, actually. Did you know there was an active plan to nuke mainland China too, as in the highest levels of the US government were planning for an imminent attack just about 60 years ago? Thankfully, President Eisenhower stepped in and said it probably wasn't a good idea. That's the story that's come to light as a still classified 1966 government study published online is getting increasing attention. The unredacted pages show how the US was thinking about responding to China in 1958 when Beijing began shelling islands under the control of the newly founded Republic of China, also known as Taiwan, which happens to be a US ally. If you comb through, you'll read that US military officials, quote, felt that the use of atomic weapons was inevitable. And, quote, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs suggested that this move would almost certainly involve nuclear retaliation from the Soviet Union, but if national policy is to defend the offshore islands, then the consequences had to be accepted. Imagine that. The consequences of a nuclear war that could have killed millions of people here and abroad would just have to be accepted as collateral damage in a confrontation with communist China. This shocking disclosure was quietly made public in 2017 by none other than Daniel Ellsberg, who is now so worried about a looming conflict that he wants to share the documents and the revelations with a wider audience. The former military analyst served as a special assistant to the Defense Department during the Vietnam War, and 50 years ago next month leaked the Pentagon Papers, a classified government study that, as the AP put it, chronicles deception and misadventure by the US in Vietnam. Ellsberg made copies of that top-secret study about the 1958 Taiwan crisis at the same time as he did the Pentagon Papers. And now, given that headlines here and abroad are using the W word when it comes to US-China relations, Ellsberg is hoping people and officials in government pay close attention to what escalating tensions with China nearly led to in the past. Given he almost went to prison last time he did this, is Ellsberg, at the age of 90, readying himself to go up against the government again? Daniel Ellsberg joins me now. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show. You held on to these documents for decades and put them online in 2017. They're now getting more attention. Why did you wait this long, Daniel? And why do you think now is the right time to be discussing the fact that the US almost dropped a nuke on China?
You know, the truth is that I was prepared to release what I had on nuclear war planning as soon as the Vietnam War had ended. I wanted to do what I could to end that war before I went to prison again on different grounds for putting out the nuclear documents. And when I wrote a draft of what is now the first third of my recent book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, I submitted that to a publisher, my same publisher that published an earlier book, Papers on the War, back in 1975, as soon as the war had ended. And her attitude of the editor was, this will sell 1,400 copies. And I said, well, that's one for every member of Congress and a lot of press. Fine. She said, no, you don't understand what I mean. That means we don't publish it. And indeed, I did try to get that word out various times. The public didn't want to hear, and except for a brief interval in the early 80s, when Physicians for Social Responsibility were making people aware of what a 1 megaton bomb would do to their cities. For once, that's the only period in that 50-year period when people had a real sense of what thermonuclear war actually meant. That went away. And when the Cold War ended, they thought the problem is over. But the weapons are still there. The plans, the threats of initiating nuclear war, first use, are still being made on both sides, by the way, now, about the Russians as well as the U.S.
So, Daniel, on that note,
I thought this is the time to bring it out, in short. Sorry.
So on that note, you mentioned the plans are there, the bombs are there. You're often asked about being a whistleblower, but really by training, by experience, you are a military analyst, an expert on nuclear strategy. In your New York Times interview, you said, quote, I do not believe the participants of this plan to attack China with a nuclear bomb were more stupid or thoughtless than those in between or in the current cabinet. When you look at the current US government, the Biden administration, people like Secretaries Blinken and Austin, how worried are you that some people today really might want a war with China, that we may inch near towards nuclear catastrophe again?
Those are two different things in a way, because I think there are very few people who actually want a war with China, and certainly not a nuclear war. And yet they're prepared to gamble, to sort of poke at the bear in the cage or something, you know, to show our anti-China attitudes, our Cold War attitudes, and that neither Democrats nor Republicans are soft on China, that they're actually taking stands here that actually could bring about war, and that very likely would be nuclear war over China, over Taiwan, as it was in 1958. It was when I read some of those headlines you just put on a month ago that I thought, wait a minute, this people have to realize what they're talking about when they're talking about war with a nuclear state, China, and especially accepting the idea of nuclear war, which is insane.
But I wonder what the stakes are for you personally. We all know releasing classified documents is against the law. There's a possibility the DOJ could come after you under the Espionage Act for doing this, which you're kind of hoping for, I believe, so you can challenge the DOJ's practice of using that act to go after whistleblowers. You want to take on this risk. So what is your game plan exactly? What are you hoping will happen?
I hope that people, on the one hand, on the trial, there's no question that what I've just done is as indictable as in the eyes of the Justice Department, which I think is on a wrong track here in the view of our First Amendment. But in terms of the prosecutions they've brought in the last 20 years, especially starting with Obama, oddly enough, and into Trump and now into Biden, who is still pursuing the extradition of Julian Assange, the fact is Julian Assange did that as a publisher, like the New York Times, in publishing this. There is no basis for indicting Julian Assange that doesn't exist for the New York Times, not only with what he put out, but what I just put out. I am not inviting an indictment of the New York Times. I think that would be bad for this country, but I am willing to risk an indictment of myself.
And you're a brave man for saying so and doing so. You mentioned the Assange extradition and the Biden administration. You said in a recent interview with The Intercept that I didn't start leaking. I was the first probably to do a mass release, and I wanted much more of that to happen as a result. More has happened, of course. You know, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, reality winner, the list goes on. But Manning spent 7 years in prison. Assange, as a publisher, as you say, is facing extradition. Winner is still in prison. Snowden won't return from Russia unless he's able to argue a public interest defense, he says, to a jury, which the current Espionage Act does not allow for, and which Joe Biden supports, as you say. Do you believe there is an ongoing war on whistleblowers, including from liberals?
Yes. One has to say that it was President Obama who campaigned on transparency in government and did not deliver on that at all. In fact, he indicted and prosecuted 3 times as many cases as all previous presidents put together. Now, that earlier period was a small number because it really violates our First Amendment. It violates the Constitution. But nevertheless, he brought 8 or 9 or 10, depending how you count some of these, like General Petraeus, as a whistleblower, even for simply giving higher than top secret information, much higher. The highest we have, covert identities of covert agents, in a document he gave to his verbal biography for him. He got a slap on the wrist for that. Now, what I'm saying is that there's no question that if you're going to indict Petraeus, like, well, he didn't publish, actually. He wanted his biographer to publish, but he didn't do it. But reality winner, who I think was a whistleblower here, very definitely in prison now. The others you mentioned, Ed Snowden in permanent exile. For me, of course, at 90, the prospect of a sentence such as I faced in 1971, which was 115 years in prison, or Assange is faced with right now, 175 years in prison, a life sentence. That doesn't mean the same for me at 90 as it means for them. Not that I want to go in prison at all, but in a way, for 50 years, prison has been my retirement plan.
And we don't Well, we don't want to see you in prison as a retirement plan or otherwise. One last question before I let you go. Quick question. You know, we're living in a very different era from when you released the Pentagon Papers back in 1971. When you look at the US today, so polarized, so divided, people in their own information bubbles, in social media silos, do you think a modern day version of the Pentagon Papers would have the same impact today, or would it simply be dismissed by partisans who don't like the fact it doesn't fit their political narratives or identities?
Mehdi, when you say that about the great difference from now, I have to tell you about a time when you were very young, I take it, but in 1971, this country was polarized about the Pentagon, about the Vietnam War, and I was called a traitor by very, very widely, though not by the Justice Department, because treason is a very narrowly defined in the Constitution, and I didn't fit that. But as of today,
it's a very good.
We are still making the threat of insane actions, the threat of nuclear attack, first use of nuclear attack to initiate nuclear war. In a variety of circumstances, we've made that commitment to a lot of allies, and we're in the process, it seems, of treating Taiwan, which the Chinese regard as part of China, but we're in the process of moving toward regarding them as having the same promise that we make to NATO of initiating nuclear war in their defense. That's the promise of an insane attack, a promise of an insane response. And
it's something
I think there
that
should be
needs
discussion of it now.
Yes, there should. There should be discussion. There should be debate. It's insane to be threatening nuclear war over anything. Daniel Ellsberg, we appreciate you coming on the show, releasing these documents, being willing to take on prison, and we thank you for everything you've done throughout your career. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.